Hello and welcome to another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. I am Chip Griffin, the founder of SAGA, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and I am happy to be joined today by a regular panelist, Patrick Rogan of Ignition HR. I almost stumbled over the company name there. I don't know why. I've worked with you for a long time, but in any case, welcome to the show, Patrick.
Thanks, Chip. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here. I'm happy it's Friday.
Yes.
It is summertime here in New Hampshire. It's a little bit on the hot side. It's, I don't know, like 95 degrees or something today, which is just a wee bit too hot. But fortunately, my home is air conditioned, so I am surviving. You're not having to watch me just drip sweat off of this bald
Me
skull
as well.
pod.
Down here in Maryland, probably be about the same. And
Yep.
it's pretty outside. So from the air conditioning, you can enjoy it better, right?
Exactly. I can look out the window and I can see it looks hot out there. So, another thing that I think a lot of people like to look at from the outside, but not necessarily the inside, is hiring. You always want to have the new employee on board, but that
Yes.
process you go through to actually get them is oftentimes painful. And so we're going to try to remove some of that pain.
Yeah.
And particularly right now, we were on a show not too long ago where we talked about how challenging it is to hire in the current environment. It is a very talent-friendly market right now, and I think it's likely to continue to be, at least for the
Yes.
foreseeable future. So what I want to talk today about is how we do a hiring process that serves the needs of the agency. How do you make sure that it's efficient but also effective? And how do you make sure it's designed so you can actually get the talent you want? Because a lot of times owners forget that this is a sales process.
Right.
The hiring process is about convincing someone to join you just as much as it is about the screening process. So, with all that said, let's start at the very beginning.
Yeah.
We've determined that we need to hire someone in our agency. We've got the budget for it. So now what do we do? Do we start by writing a job description? Do we start by just saying, "Hey, I need something"? How do you generally advise people to get started?
Well, Chip, I usually recommend a few steps before all that.
Okay.
And the first recommendation I have, and I get this question a lot from my clients, in particular my agency clients, and my first recommendation is something not to do. And that is, for heaven's sakes, please don't panic. But that's the most
Always good
common
advice in almost
emotion
every.
that I get,
Yes.
though.
Yes.
Because what happens is if you panic, then you tend to skip steps. So I have a resource shortage in my agency. So I need to hire someone tomorrow. I need to have someone here tomorrow. Do you really? I mean, I get it. There's an urgent need, but my recommendation is let's take a few steps before we start engaging in the recruiting process, and that will guide where we're going to go along that process. If that makes any sense. So
It does. So start by being thoughtful, being deliberate, being intentional about the process that you're creating.
and ask yourself first the question: why are my current resources coming up short? Right. So what is the genesis for this? Because that's probably the most important question. Is there new business that I hadn't anticipated? Are my current clients changing direction and I have to do something differently that I hadn't anticipated? Am I losing my current staff, or are people leaving? Is that driving it? Because whichever of those options is driving, then that can help you come up with a solution, but also maybe spend a little bit more time taking away, like maybe recruiting is covering a symptom, but the illness is there's a problem with turnover in my organization. And you could recruit like crazy and hire tons of people and keep
Right.
them coming in. But if they're still going back out, it's like, well, stop, hold on.
Right.
Why are they leaving?
Right. So think about what you actually need. So if it's someone who's departing, don't necessarily just dust off their
Right.
job description and put it out there. If
Right.
it's a new hire, think about, are you trying to get more work hours? Are you trying to get specific skill sets that you're lacking?
Right.
Really, really be thoughtful and dig into what it is that you need and start from there.
And how sustained do you think this need is going to be? Is this something you could easily knock out with a freelancer? Or maybe it's going to be sustained and you need to hire someone, a full-time employee, because it looks like, chances are, based upon the pipeline and all your data, that this is going to be sustained. Maybe do you need a full-time person, or would a part-time person solve your needs? I mean, I'm seeing a lot more part-time opportunities out there, and people who are more interested in working part-time, who have solid skills. Maybe that's the option. Or maybe it is a full-time, but I'm just saying, ask the questions. Make sure you're there are a lot of steps that we're going to be talking about here. And when you get to the end and you followed all the steps, the analogy I like to use is, what you really hate is when you've taken all the time and effort to climb a tree and you get to the top and you figured out you climbed the wrong tree. Let's make sure we're climbing the right tree when we do our recruiting. So after we've covered all that, the first thing I like to do is get real clear on what are the skills specifically do I need, and look at it from a perspective of what other things am I going to need this person logically to do down the road too, right? Because think about it, when you hire someone for a role, after 5 years, are they doing the same exact thing? Maybe they're doing something different. So keep that in mind, because you'll want to look at that when you're screening candidates and looking at backgrounds. The next thing I like to do is ask the question, why would someone want to come and work here? So, and that's a hard question to ask, but what is the employee value proposition? Because you're going to want to use that in the process. And we can talk about that a little bit more later on. And then we get into the gist of it, which is the sourcing strategy. Do you want to talk about that now, or you were going to say something?
Let's talk a little bit about the specifications, right? Because this is the job description, which is where we start, and that incorporates the two things that you've talked about. Right. And so that's, how are you going to describe the position and what you're looking for in your ideal candidate? And the job description also needs to, in part, be that sales document that speaks to why does someone want to come work for my agency. So let's deal with that first part first, because I think a lot of folks stumble in writing the job description because they turn it into a laundry list. And instead of crafting the vision for what a role is and thinking through what the must-haves are and the nice-to-haves, they just kind of dump it all out there. And so you look at these job descriptions, you're looking for someone who doesn't exist. Right? You're looking for someone who is superhuman because they can write, they're great on camera, they can sell, they're great on details. Everything under the sun. So I think it's important to think through what you actually need and differentiate between those must-haves and nice-to-haves so that you can describe the role in such a way that you scare off the people who are not good fits,
right? But
you attract those who are.
Yeah, I usually recommend 3 sections to the job description, Chip. The first is, and this is a little bit more of the why would they want to come work for me, is describe a little bit about your organization. What is it you do? Where you succeed? Not super large, but an introductory in terms of this is who we are, this is what we do, this is why we're successful. So that's the piece I always like to start with, because that's a little bit more salesy and draw someone in to perhaps wanting to learn more about your organization. The second and probably most important piece is, what is this role? Like, specifically, if you're in this role, describe what are the things that you're going to be doing, starting with the most important aspects, and then the second most important aspects, and then things that may happen occasionally. Paint a picture for the person who's going to be reading this, that if they're working there, this is where they're going to be spending their time. And then the third section is, these are the skills you need to bring to the table. And you were kind of talking about that. So you absolutely have to have this solidly. 6+ years experience of design, or, you need to have, a solid strategy background with experience in these industries, or, whatever they are. Start with what you have to have for this role, both current and in the future. And then, talk about some, and it would be nice if you had this. It would be nice if you had one of these 3 things. And if you really did this well, you would be just outstanding, Right.
But everything you put on that requirements list, ask yourself, do I really need that?
Yeah.
Right? Because I often see folks who list more experience than they truly need for a particular role, because sometimes someone with 2 years experience, if they're the right person, they may be a good fit. So do you really want to say that it has to be 5+ and scare that person off? right? Conversely, if you absolutely need someone who's not green, you don't want to leave it open-ended enough that it's, someone fresh out of college is going to do it. And by the way, while we're on that subject,
Yeah.
don't throw in that you need a college degree unless there's some real damn reason they need a college degree,
I
because
totally agree with that.
I think the current higher education system is messed up. We can talk about that some other time.
That's a whole session.
But change is not driven by the educators themselves. It will be driven by employers not requiring senseless degrees for things that just don't matter. I mean, I am shocked by the number of agency job descriptions that don't just require a 4-year college degree, but in a specific subject. Really?
Right.
Why? Ask your colleagues, ask around, find out how many of them have degrees in whatever you've put on that job description and who you're now disqualifying if they actually pay attention to it.
And you'd be amazed. I've actually tracked this a little bit because it drives me a little bit crazy as well too. And I'll frequently push back. The number of times where there's a requirement for a specific degree or a specific advanced degree, the person who wrote it has that same degree. It's like, okay, you don't need a clone of you.
Right. You don't want a clone of you. Generally speaking, when you're hiring,
Right.
you do not want a clone of yourself.
So
Think about how miserable you would be to work for.
why would you want another one of you? You have other
Right,
stuff
yeah.
that you can't do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's important. And I also push back a lot on these requirements that are really, because what happens is the absolute must-haves frequently are driven by the panic that got us to this situation in the first place. So I have an immediate need that needs to be done next week. Well, the reality is this person you're going to be hiring, they're not going to be here next week. So get beyond that immediate need, that panic
Right.
that drove you to the panic that you have right now, and focus on realistically, what do you want in this role long time? Like a year, 2 years, 3 years. And that will kind of drive what's really required versus nice to have, I think.
Right. And think through, too, what really differentiates it in the mind of the candidate. So I think just about every agency job description I've ever seen says, you need to have excellent oral and written communication skills. Well, no, duh.
Yeah.
And who is going to sit there and say, no, I suck at communications, I'm not going to apply for this role, right? It doesn't serve any purpose. I mean, if you need something just to fill up the page, I guess maybe throw it in there, but that's all that kind of a line is doing. It's not really helping anyone on either end of the discussion. So, really get rid of some of that stuff. Don't, and when you put things in your job description like, needs to work well in a high pressure, fast paced environment, what you're really saying is, it's a crappy place to work.
You don't want to come here.
Right? I mean, that's honestly, if you see that in a job description, that's what it means. It means we burn our people out, we burn the candle at both ends, and we just don't care. And we want you to sign up for that. Okay. Why? Maybe address, going back to what you said earlier, maybe address the actual processes and structures and systems that are causing that kind of thing to happen. Maybe it's that you're pricing wrong. Maybe it's that you're staffing wrong. Who knows what it is? But address that. Don't just, throw more bodies at it.
And don't add huge volume to your position description that just doesn't need to be there. It shouldn't look
Right.
like War and Peace, for crying out loud. It should look like something like the question I always ask is, so let's say you're not the manager or you're not the agency owner. You're actually the person who's reading this position description. What would you think about this? Like in their
Right.
eyes, look at it. I've seen some really cool position descriptions recently that incorporate video and have like a really neat look and feel to them. And particularly if you're in the design world or in the production world, show off your stuff. If you're going to be doing a shoot, like add some content specific to your organization. This is our strategy. This is what we do. This is how we excel. This is why people come here. These are employees who are here right now and why they love their job. Candidates love that. And if it's a production type position, for heaven's sakes, dress it up a little bit. These are people who really understand what good design looks like.
Right. And the potential candidate wants to know what it's like to work there, right? So they want to know what the job is. So you need to be
Right.
clear about that and paint a
Right.
good picture. But they want to know what the environment is like. They want to know who else works there. And so this is where I think a lot of agencies, they think about their websites, for example, in terms of, how are potential clients looking at it. The
Right.
reality is, in most cases, you're more likely to have potential job seekers looking at your website than
For
potential
sure.
clients. Most
Yes.
potential clients are coming in from some other way. Maybe they go on there to look at how to contact you or something like that, but they're not browsing the about page. But potential new hires are.
For
They're
sure.
looking through to see who else is there. What kind of titles do they have? What does the team look like? If you've got some video of the team, even better, because that gives them a sense to start to get to know the agency before you're even coming in for an interview. So don't miss out on the opportunity either in the job description or on your website or on social media to really personalize your team and make it so that a job seeker will understand what it's like to work there.
I found, Chip, the vast majority of candidates that I see for agency positions have a pretty solid portfolio themselves that it's real easy to get a hold of. So for heaven's sakes, they're coming to work for you. You know, you don't want their portfolio to be better than yours.
Right. Right.
You better have something there from the candidate's perspective. I agree with you. That's going to resonate well. And that they can see, well, maybe this is a place I can learn something or grow in my career. I think that's key.
Right. So the last thing on the job description before we start moving into the actual recruiting process,
Right.
title. How important is the title that you put on the new role?
Well, I think it's really important, and I get a lot of question about titles because there's the perspective that if I pay someone, if I use a particular title, that puts me in a different pay range, and what I find is having a title that matches a role just kind of smooths everything out. When you have a much higher title from the role you really need, you're going to get more senior people than you want for the role, or it just gets kind of misaligned. It's okay to be creative with titles as long as they match what's going to be done and it resonates well with the person, again, who's going to be reading the position description. You don't want confusion. You don't want a misalignment between, well, here's the title and then here's a position description. It's like, well, why is it called that? That just kind of seems kind of crazy. I like consistency as much as I can get it.
Yeah. So you raised compensation. Should you list a compensation range in your job description?
In Colorado, you have to. So it's getting, I'm seeing it more and more. In general, I don't like listing compensation because it kind of boxes you in a little bit. But compensation is a hot topic right now. And the first recommendation I make with compensation is do not ask someone their salary history. In at least 17 states, it's illegal. And it's just immaterial. It's not important to the conversation. At some point, I think it's important to ask the candidate, what are their salary requirements, or do they have a compensation range? But if you don't know ahead of time what you want to pay for this position, you skipped an important step that is much earlier in the process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've got a pretty good job description that we've put together. We've been thoughtful about what we're looking for. Now, how do we go about finding? We take this job description and just throw it up on Indeed, Monster, LinkedIn, and see what we get?
Well, it depends. If you want to throw something up against the wall, that's one option. See what sticks. I usually recommend. The vast majority of positions are filled by someone in a network. So as an agency owner, I usually recommend starting with your network and put the word out there. You've got a position posted, you can send a link to it. Hey, got a key position open in my organization. If you know someone who you think would be a good fit, please send them this link or have them reach for me directly. This, by the way, I think is something that should never stop. There's a thing called recruiting inertia, right? And it's huge. So as long as you continue to look for talent, finding more talent is much easier than if you stop. When you stop and then start it up, it just takes forever to get rolling. So I think the personal network is important. I think going a step beyond your personal network, so your network's network is also a valuable resource. And make sure if you know someone else who knows someone else, please send them my way. I think your employees' network is an often overlooked opportunity area for finding talent. What I've described so far is how the majority of positions end up being filled right now that I see. There are other resources, but those I think are the key, most important ones.
So I agree with you, and it's typically how I've filled roles over the last couple of decades, and I think it's a really good way from the perspective of you generally end up with people who are already somewhat vetted.
Hmm.
They, you know, generally speaking, particularly employees are not going to recommend a bad hire because
Right.
they don't want to be working alongside a bad hire. But recently, there's been some pushback to this idea of using your network as the big driver of recruitment because it can hold back achieving DEI goals. Because if you use your own networks, you typically end up with a much more homogenous workforce. So, what's your answer or antidote to that?
Yeah, I should have listed that caveat at the beginning. So, assuming you have a diverse workforce, using your network is going to tend to bring you candidates that match the socioeconomic background, which will by default match from a gender and ethnicity perspective. You'll click from a DEI perspective. You'll click a lot of boxes. But you're right. If your employee population is not diverse, and again, make sure we're like when I've had clients say, well, we have the most diverse thought of any organization I've ever been in. And I think that's great. That's wonderful. But diversity is measured in more dimensions than thought, right? And if you don't have socioeconomic diversity, if you don't have diversity of ethnicity and gender, even in a smaller organization, then do you really? I don't think you do.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to broaden your diversity mix in your organization, then you're right. You do have to go beyond existing networks, and there are a number of avenues to get there. There are sites you can post on. You can use recruiters. I mean, there's a whole host of levers. You can. One of the things, like if you are using a recruiter, you can easily say, look, I will only consider slates of candidates that are diverse. If you don't send me a diverse slate of candidates, then I'm not going to consider any of them. So that kind
Mm-hmm.
of puts the pressure there and kind of lets them know you're serious. I have some organizations where have had for a particular position, like if you have a position that's important, but it doesn't urgently need to be filled right away, it's perfectly rational to target that position to be a diverse hire, either on gender, ethnicity, or something else that's particularly important to your organization. That's okay to do. So that's another avenue that you might have. Like when you look at a particular position, what is your strategy going to be from a sourcing perspective in terms of how you're going to get there?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how we start to get names into the pool. Now what? We've got resumes coming in. We've got people throwing their hat in the ring. How do we decide who to interview and what kind of process? How rigorous should it be? Let's explore that for a little bit.
Yeah, the devil's in the details here, Chip. I have a lot of clients who are early in the process. What I frequently hear is, you know what, I'm pretty good at hiring, and I kind of hire by my gut. And if I find someone who I feel is a fit for my organization, I'm pretty good at determining that's the right person. That's kind of who I go with. I know there's a lot of different things you can do with interviewing, but I'm not really a fan of that. And I'm always really cautious with that because there are situations where you might generally do that. But as your organization grows, you're going to have other people in your organization who are going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the selection process. And if you expect them to have the same gut you do, then that's probably not going to work. And the data tells us that it just isn't as accurate as you think it is. Going to a more of a structured interview process yields much better hires. And by a structured interview process, I think it's important that you hire to the position description. You have consistent questions that you ask candidate relative to the positions. You ask about the same questions to all candidates. You have an apples to apples comparison. And I do like questions that are a little bit of a blend of backward and forward facing. So backward facing, looking at the past, a behavioral interview question is, give me an example of a time when you faced this type of a problem. And let's talk about how you got through that. So that's the past, indicating potentially success in the future. I also think it's important to ask a situational question or two. So in our organization, we typically have a problem, with this. So if given this scenario, how would you approach that? What are the first three things you would do? And ask that same question. So that kind of you blend those two together, the past and the future, you get some perspective in terms of how they would work in your organization. You have consistency in terms of the types of questions that you're answering. And you now have a process that doesn't relate on your gut. It's something that you can replicate throughout your organization and feel comfortable you're probably going to get the right hire.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the important things with questions is to make sure that you know what you can and can't ask. You already talked about salary history being one of those things, but you and I have talked many times in the past, both publicly and privately, about some of the horrific questions that we have seen, particularly when you have more junior people involved in the hiring process who have never received any training about how to properly interview. And it's really important to understand those things. And if you're going to be having younger employees, less experienced employees as part of the process, which can be a good thing, right? I mean, it can be really helpful to get perspectives of different folks on your team. You need to make sure that they know what the parameters are so that you're not creating problems for yourself.
Yeah, I always cover this on all the interview trainings that I do. And it does scare me quite a bit when I hear some of the questions that not just new interviewers, but sometimes experienced interviewers ask. Right. And they usually come from a place of the best of intentions, but obviously we need a little bit more than that. I had a situation, there was a manager who had just recently had a baby and was all excited about it and was interviewing a candidate. It had been like weeks earlier that the baby had been born, and it was like, I got to tell you, I'm just so excited. I have a baby boy, and he's great, and I love him. Do you have kids? No, no, you can't ask that. What kind of car do you drive? No, you don't need to know what kind of car these are work hours. Can you get to the workplace on time? You can ask that question. What kind of car you drive, what kind of church you go to, what's your political affiliation. Don't ask any of those questions. They're bad.
Right. I had one employee who very proudly told me one of the questions that he typically liked to ask, and it came from a place of good intention, but the question was, what do you like to do on Saturday night? No, and I understood it was trying to evoke some personality from the individual and just have a good. No, there's so many things that can come out as an answer to that just become huge problems. So anyway, so be careful with the questions. But now, so everybody's doing interviews of some sort or another. Mm-hmm. What about some agencies like to do a more formal process where they ask them to do a particular writing sample? I've seen some agencies that will ask you to put together a sample plan for a client on something. How do you feel about those kinds of things?
Well, it's a good idea to get some perspective on if someone can write. I think there are a number of tools out there that have been validated. So you have to be careful on any test that you give a candidate that it doesn't put you sideways with the EEOC. And what they're looking for is they want a reasonable expectation that if someone takes this test, there isn't going to be a bias based upon any of the protected class categories. And so it's something you make up on the fly. I think it's okay to ask a question, but if you're going to have them take a test, be careful that you're not going to perhaps get a little bit sideways with the EEOC. Those can be particularly expensive little problems.
I mean, do you find that those tests are actually a good predictor? Because I'll be honest, every time I've seen it, they seem like more busy work than anything else and don't really tell me how this employee is going to perform in a real world environment. So I personally am not a big fan of any of those kinds of things.
The ones that scare me are the ones that people make up on the fly.
Right.
Which
is what most of them are. Most of them are not some tried and true. I have this idea.
If it's a real junior level position, which really isn't going to apply to agencies, like if it's a customer service position or those kind of things, sometimes I've seen those work. But in the agency world, I've never really seen them add value. And sometimes they create confusion. And then depending upon how much time it takes the candidate to complete this thing, and it seems kind of weird to them, it could throw them. You could lose your best candidate in the process.
Right.
Yeah.
So Let's look at that time element here, and we're sort of running against our own time here. But
Yeah,
the beauty is that we control the channel here, so nope, there's no other show coming on. So we're going to go a couple minutes over if it's okay with you, Patrick.
do it.
So how long should the process take? And I mean this more so from the not necessarily the writing the description part, but from the point where you've got people submitting their resumes, their applications, to when you actually make a decision. Because I think that sometimes these processes get so drawn out that you lose good candidates. On the other hand, if you rush the process, you may not find a particularly good candidate, or you may cut corners and accept less than what you're looking for.
So this is an area I get a lot of questions about, and I think it's really, really important. I remember I started working years ago at an organization, and they had the most long, drawn out interview process. It was basically death by interview. If you survived the interview process, just because you survived it, we should hire you.
Yes.
And obviously the best candidates they lost along the way because it was just ridiculously long. They were a very risk averse environment, but whatever. So I don't recommend doing that. I do recommend having the shortest interview process possible that yields you the best hire. And by that, I mean, make sure it's long enough that you've been able to really learn from different people's perspective in your company who this person is and if they're going to be a fit for your organization. But similarly, each of those individuals have shared with the candidates your agency and what you're about, so that on both sides, there's enough information to make a good decision. One of the pieces of data that I like to keep for my clients is the number of candidates who've been hired from a secondary process. So basically, you post a position or someone refers someone, you go through an interview process, you maybe hire that person, maybe you don't. If you don't, you keep in touch with that person, another position opens, you already know this person. So that's a second touch candidate is what I call it. So that person already jumps to the front of the line, and that's how you really fill a position quickly, because you already knew someone. And by keeping that relationship going, you can make it happen fast. So as much as you need to get a good hire and provide the candidate with information they need. But for heaven's sakes, if it stretches for a month or two, you're probably over engineering.
Yeah, I like the way you describe that as really the shortest that still gets you what you want, basically.
Right. Yeah.
To pare it down. And so if you think of it that way, and you're always communicating with the candidates, right? I think that's a key part of it. You need to communicate with the candidates at each step in the process so they know where does the process stand. Set their expectations for how long it's going to take. If you're doing first interviews and it's going to take you a couple of weeks to do them, communicate that so that they're not left hanging and figure, okay, 3 days later I haven't heard anything, I must be out of the process. Sometimes if you're an owner and you're traveling or you've got client engagements, you may have to have a slower process because you just don't have the time. Communicate that. Help them to understand. I'm going on vacation next week. You will not hear from me next week. I will get back to you the week after that. Whatever it is, that can help you get through the process and make sure that everybody's on the same page.
And I would say related to that real quick, I think it's important to have someone that candidates can talk to who can get back to them quickly. And as an agency owner, that's probably not you. So maybe it's your assistant, maybe it's a junior person on staff. If you have an HR consultant, that could be the person, whoever it is. Make sure you have one person identified that, like, let's say I get a job offer. I'm a candidate. I have a job offer. I'm in play for a position with you. I'd like to let you know I have a job offer. If you're going to make me an offer, there should be someone I could talk to quickly because I may not be able to reach you. I think that's important.
So, Patrick, we've covered a lot of ground here, but we've still only really skimmed the surface.
Really?
And the next time I have you on, we'll have to go through offer negotiation and onboarding because that's important too. But we've at least taken folks through the process now to start winnowing the field down and making their choice. So I think that's a good place to take a break for today. But if someone is anxious for help sooner or would like more resources, how can they get in touch with you?
Oh, real easy. They can find me quickly at ignitionhr.com.
Excellent. And of course, if you are interested in learning more about the Small Agency Growth Alliance, you can go to small-agency-growth.com. And if you want to see replays of this or any of the other videos that we have, go to small-agency.tv. And so with that, that will bring to an end another episode of the Small Agency Talk Show. Patrick, I look forward to having you back here so that we can continue that conversation and have others as well. And I look forward to having you, the viewers, back here again next week. In the meantime, have a great weekend, everybody.